In China. I'm pleased to say we're joined now on the line by the risk analyst Marco Vicenzino. Thanks for speaking to us today on France 24, sir. And before we come to the demonstrations themselves, today state media in China is reporting that the country's former leader, Jiang Zemin, has died. Now, he played a key role in crushing the 1989 democracy protests in China. This was around the time of Tiananmen Square. So just how influential a figure was he on this government, particularly when it comes to the crackdown we're witnessing today?
Well, when he took power, apart from his participation happened at post Tiananmen, he ruled from 1989 to 2002. He oversaw a period of radical reform, market-oriented reform. So in one sense, yes, there was political crackdown, but there was much more market opening. And for an entire generation, he put his political appointees in power. When in around 2012, when the current president comes into power, he begins a phase. He starts phasing out all of Xi Jinping's people to the point where in October of this year, when he consolidated his third term in power, call it absolute power. By then, most of Xi Jinping's influence and all those of his supporters have pretty much, they're not present in the party anymore. So it was a generational process. But now the current president, like I said, his third term has fully consolidated power.
All right, well, let's talk about the protests that we're witnessing today in China. It's obviously very difficult to get information out of the country, but based on your understanding right now, just how widespread is this unrest?
It seems to be in urban centers, looking like probably over a dozen of them, or roughly a dozen. It's a case of classic overreach. Actually, it's a reaction to his failed zero COVID policy. It's a reaction to his failure of mass vaccination, and it's a reaction to his draconian lockdowns. So bottom line is now that people have reacted. It's strange, but it's quite ironic because after consolidating power in October, formally for his third term, about a month later, you have these massive protests taking place. I think he's going by the playbook is you blame local officials. That's what was exactly done when COVID first broke out in December of 2019 and January of 2020 in the city of Wuhan, is that the government tried to muzzle and to silence any news of a virus coming out. And then as a result, once it blew up in their face, they started blaming local officials. Now, I think it's the same thing is taking place. They'll blame local officials. They'll close down those city centers with heavy police presence. They make promises, the promises like mass vaccination, making promises to try to diffuse the current situation, and then crack down on all protesters, hunt them down one by one, and to set an example to deter others from doing so.
Well, you mentioned those mass vaccinations, and I believe you're referring to this announcement a bit earlier on this week that the government would ramp up COVID vaccines, particularly for the elderly. Does that suggest to you then, this announcement this week, that the unrest, the protests, is prompting the government to relax its COVID rules somewhat?
I don't say relax their COVID rules, is trying to put it in a different form, word it in a different way. I don't think they're going to, because have those COVID rules, that zero COVID policy allows for a concentration and centralization of power. So there's a strong political dimension to that zero COVID policy. And I think they want to retain that, but rhetorically use the language of some form of reconciliation, making promises with that objective of diffusing the situation at present time. Listen, the Sinovac, the Chinese-made virus, the Sinovac, it's been proven globally that it doesn't work as effectively as many of the Western vaccines, and he's refused to use them. Much of that is also there's a political dynamic to that. So I think what he's trying to do is diffuse the situation as much as possible. Like I said, blame local officials, make as many promises as possible, and at the same time crack down with an iron fist.
And just finally, then, you don't believe that there's any evidence, based on what you're saying, that these protests will threaten President Xi Jinping himself?
It is, like I said, after his consolidation of power in October, it is this more serious threat that he's seen to his power right now. That playbook that he's so far, I think it's worked for him in the past when there's been some kind of opposition. But this time he's got to ramp it up, and he went that part of that crackdown part of it, of everything I described in that playbook, is the most serious one that he's relying upon to retain power. He's done it in the past. he's committed to doing so right now. And I think within the party itself, he obviously has the support necessary. But once again, if you have mass protests taking place on a massive scale throughout the country, that does remain a serious challenge.
Marco Vicenzino, thanks very much indeed, sir, for speaking to us on the programme.
Thank you.
In other news, the